Good evening, folks, and welcome back to our video primer on joints in Maya. If you've done 3D animation before and you're familiar with how joints or bone like skeletal systems work, again, this is not a tutorial for you. But if you are new to this sort of thing, stick around. Hopefully, you'll learn something. What we'll be covering in this video is how joints bind to skin, how to bind and unbind, and how skin clusters interact with different joints in a system. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and delete this off, and we'll make our first skin piece. Let's go ahead and jump into our side view. I'm going to drop in a cylinder. Rotate that cylinder 90 degrees in the X. Make it 10 units long. And now I will add a joint at the right here. I'll do one in the middle and then one at the end. So you can't see the joints. If you hit 4 on the keyboard, you can see it in wireframe. But there's actually a better way. So if I hit 5 to bring up shaded, I can then go up to this shading panel right here. This is right at the edge of the viewport. I can come down to X-ray joints, and that'll show me my joints through my model, which is nice. So to get our joints to manipulate the skin, we need to combine it to the skin, or do what's called binding. So if I select the beginning of the chain, go ahead and select the skin, hold shift, select the skin, go up to skin, go down to bind, and then open the options box. I recommend always using the options box because you never know what settings have changed or if the default settings are applied. I generally use binding method to the joint hierarchy. This will bind. It'll look at the entire skeleton and try to find the skin cluster associated with that particular joint. The binding method I have set to geodesic voxel. What geodesic voxel does is it creates basically an area of influence between this joint and then a radius of influence for the skin cluster. But it does it by basically stacking a bunch of little cuboid, sort of voxel shapes there to kind of fill that out. That's not very important, but I do like the result of geodesic voxel over some of these other ones. Closest and distance will look at the joint chain, and it'll try to figure out what skin cluster is closest to that joint, and it'll say, hey, we're close enough, we should be friends. And if this one's far enough away, it'll say, yeah, I don't like you. This is what it does. Close and hierarchy, kind of the same thing, but it'll prioritize the position of a joint in the hierarchy over, say, like, this skin cluster here is closer to this joint in the hierarchy than it is to this joint. So this side will likely get paired here versus this side pairing with that one. And you can read about these in the Maya wiki. And then we have, I'm going to set that back to geodesic voxel because that's what I prefer. And then down here we have max influences. And max influences determine how many joints a single skin cluster, remember the skin cluster is just this group of vertices, so how many joints this skin cluster can talk to. If we set it to a larger number like 5 to 7, which is appropriate for sort of like a humanoid kind of character, then this skin cluster can talk to this joint, and then this joint, and then this joint down the chain, and you can do it up to about 5 or however many influences you give it. If you set it to a low number of influences, say like 1, that means only 1 joint per skin cluster, right? Max influences of 2 means that 2 joints per skin cluster, and so on and so forth. If you check maintain max influences, then when you go to do your skin weighting, this number will never change. So like I could never give more than 1 joint to this skin cluster. If I do 2, then maybe I could pair this skin cluster with these 2 joints, but I couldn't do all 3 joints. It could never go above that if this is checked. Okay. Now there are some mixed results with maintaining max influences. I've seen it have some hang-ups and not work. I've seen it work. I guess it's one of those things that goes up and down with Maya. You just have to kind of try it and see what you play with. In my experience, I generally keep it off because I have better results keeping it off than doing keeping it on. We'll go ahead and use it though. So let's go ahead and do, let's set it to 2, and I'll check maintain. I'll hit apply. Oh, you gotta be in object mode, sorry. Select the joint, select the skin, hit apply. And now we have this joint is connected to the skin, and you can see that it's working. But it doesn't bend in the middle. See that? Now the reason it doesn't bend in the middle has to do with the skin cluster. So we have a skin cluster. If I go back into vertex mode, so I have skin cluster here. I have a skin cluster here, and I have a skin cluster here, but I don't have one in the middle. Without the skin cluster in the middle, we can't bend it. What I always tell my students is you just can't bend a broomstick. So if you want this to bend in the middle, you have to add a edge loop in here or some vertices so that you can assign the value. Let's go ahead and do that. Go back to object mode. And then I'll go to, change this to modeling. We'll grab our insert edge loop tool that's under mesh tools here. Insert edge loop, and I'll go ahead and add one right there. Okay. So now I have the edge loop in there. Go back to object mode. And you'll see that we still can't bend it. Come here, you. It doesn't bend because this skin cluster hasn't been assigned to anything. So we're going to have to unbind this skin. Go ahead and select your joints. Select your skin. We're going to go back into our rigging tab. And under skin, we're going to go down to unbind. So I'm going to go ahead and open that checkbox. Or sorry, open the options box. Now we do have a few options. You can delete history, keep history, or bake history. Now what these do, if I hit delete history, it'll remove the skin cluster history on this mesh here and drop it back to normal. So if I hit apply, you can see this is no longer bent. It's no longer following the influence of the joint. If I undo that, and I say keep history, hit apply, it's going to snap back down, but then when I go to reattach it, it's going to remember the influence of these points. And then if I say bake history, what it'll do is it'll detach it, but it'll maintain the current bend that's on here. So I'll hit apply. And the joints did detach, no longer attached. But the skin is now permanently in this configuration, which is nice if you're trying to do like a statue and you want to pose the statue and then do whatever later on. It's a good way of doing it. Okay. But I will delete history, detach. I'll set that back to 0. You always want to set your skeleton back to its bind pose before you assign it anything. Select the skeleton, select the skin, and then we will rebind. Yep. Now I should be able to bend the elbow, and you can see that it bends there. Now it doesn't bend perfectly because we haven't done any skin weights, but what you can see here is that this skin cluster, it's bound to here, but it's also sharing to here. And the way to see that, let me hit spacebar and come out. I'm going to select the skin and the skeleton, and we're going to look at the skin weights. Let's go up to skin and then paint skin weights. When you open that up, you'll get your joints in the list. And you can see with this joint selected, right there. So this is joint 1, this is joint 2, this is joint 3. We don't see him in the list because we only set it to maintain 2 influences. But you can see this joint here has some influence. And the way you can look is there's a light gray shading on here. And then as it goes down, it gets darker. So that darker color means that there's less influence on the joint here than here. And if I come down and check use color ramp, you'll be able to see that better. So on the color ramp, you can see this higher yellow has higher influence, and as we get down this way, we have less and less influence. And you can see the color ramping here. So red to white is the most influence, and then green to blue to black is low to no influence. If I change the value here, let's say value of 0.1, I'll just hit add. Make sure I'm going to choose this joint here, so that's going to be my joint 1. And you can see this is its amount of influence. And just go ahead and paint on this. I can change the level of influence this joint has. And you can see the stronger the influence, the brighter the color. So eventually, if I assign this like 100% influence, it should map right to that joint like that. So now this skin cluster only talks to that, and this skin cluster kind of works in between. You can see the influence there. And if I bend the joint, I get a better bend. And I can do the same thing with this here. So if I grab this joint and the skin, open up my skin weights, I'll go to joint 2, and I will paint right here and just paint that up. And once again, you don't have to worry about this last joint being in our list. The joint at the end of the chain typically doesn't have any influence, so it's okay for it not to show up. If it does show up, that's fine. If it doesn't show up, that's fine as well. And there we go. So you can see as I painted that away, this joint has 100% influence here. It tapers down. It has a little bit of influence here, and this joint, or this skin cluster, is shared between here and there. This skin cluster has no influence with this joint here. You can see it's painted black. Same thing this way. This one has 100% influence. It shares influence here on that skin cluster, but it has no influence on that skin cluster. And if I select it, I can bend it just like that. Okay. So last thing I want to take a look at is the maintaining of max influences. So if I select my skin cluster and I come into the attributes, it's right here. If you don't see the attributes here, you can do Control A, that'll get you there. Or you can also hit the little attributes panel right here. It's right next to the hammer. If you open that up, you can go to where it says skin cluster, and you can see right here max influence is set to 2, and maintain max influences is checked. You can, of course, turn this off and on here. I'm going to go ahead and go back into my skin weights. So select the skeleton, select the skin, open up skin weights. I'm going to go to joint 1. You can see how I'm sharing the skin cluster here. I'm going to try to share this skin cluster to all 3 joints. Now the reason that I can't, again, have it set to only 2 influences. So that means at any given time, I can never have more than 2 influences on here. So if I try to share, I can only share between these 2. Let's go ahead and unbind the skin and change the level of the amount of influences. So I'm going to go ahead and set this back down to 0. Let's rotate that joint back to 0. Going to unbind. So skin, unbind. I have delete history checked, so I'll go ahead and do that. Bring up my skin binding options. I'll give it 3 influences. And I'm going to check. I'll make this at 3, and then I'll hit apply. And now let's see what we have. So that one to there. So skeleton to skin. Open that up. So now I see all 3 joints. So I have joint 1, 2, and 3. So now that I have it able to attach to more than 3 or more than 2 joints, you can see that that last joint is now in there, and we will have influence on it. So let's go ahead and bend this just a little bit. Go back into the skin weights. So let's see what happens if we assign And you can see this last joint is set to purple to black because it doesn't really have any influence, right? Let's go ahead and give it some influence. I'll select it. I'll choose add, and then I will just paint the value. And I'll make this 100%. Now I can kind of cheat this. I can ramp this value all the way up to 1, and when I paint it, it will just go straight to 100%. Conversely, I can also put it to 0, and I can paint this end to solid black and get kind of a similar effect. Or I can paint this to black. But you can see I have it set to add, so you can't add 0, so I have to hit replace, and then you can do that. And it does get wonky if you paint it off and it has to snap to somewhere. It does get wonky. You can see it trying to share between. I took that off and that off. Let's go ahead and assign it. So joint 1. Set that to replace. I'll go to my value. Give that 1 real quick. And you can see as I'm painting that is, of course, snapping in. I'll give joint 2 100% right here. You can see as I'm doing that, it's getting really weird because this joint is bent and that joint is getting 100% influence over that skin cluster. And you can see here, no influence on that skin cluster for that joint. And then this one, I'll do 100%. As well. Now, one thing to note as you're doing this, the skin weighting does affect vertices, not faces, which is why I have to kind of click, because I have to drag toward that vertex that is associated with it. So there we go. So this skin cluster is 100% to that joint. This skin cluster, there we go, is 100% to that joint. And then this skin cluster is 100% there with no sharing. So since it's not sharing, it's just two tubes bending, and they bend kind of weird. Right? Now, if you wanted to share, you can pick the joint and say joint 2. And I can choose to smooth. So you can check smooth and just paint, and it will try to smooth out between and give a good sharing value between the two joints. Now, if you don't like to click and click, you can see every time I click that I'm modifying that smooth value. Well, one of the nice things about working with this is you can actually hold down the shift key. Shift also does smoothing as one pass. So if I go ahead and I'd go to like replace, for example, you can see that there's an R on the circle. If I hold down shift, it changes to smooth. So if I say I paint this and then I want to smooth it, I can hold shift and then just do it this way without having to have it stuck, you know, here and then just click, 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 click. And then I can work as I go. So that's shared. I'm also going to share from this joint influence this way because I have it allowing up to 3 joints or 3 areas of influence per skin cluster. I can, of course, share between all of them. And there we go. So now they're all sharing this joint. Let's see what happens when I bend it. So you can see at the end here, that flexes just a little bit. And then right here, that flexes. And if you're not paying attention, you might not see that this flexes just a tad bit as well. Okay. And of course, I could allow this joint to share with the top here. So if I go and grab joint 1, you can see joint 1 has no influence over here. And joint 3 has very little influence, but it does have some toward that skin cluster there. So if I go back to joint 1, I'll go to add. I'll just add a very small value to this. So now this joint has some influence over there. And we'll see that flexing more. So the top of that flexes more based on the position of this. Okay. That's a quick overview. Hopefully it didn't go too long, half hour or so. But that's a quick overview on joints and a quick, very brief look into skin weighting. Hopefully it's been educational for you. And of course, if you liked it, hit the checkbox. And I will see you guys in the next video.